Perhaps the most common kind of inductive argument is called an inference to the best explanation. Now, to understand this kind of argument, we need to think way back to the first week when we discussed the difference between justification and explanation. If somebody uses an argument to justify a conclusion, then they're trying to give a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. And maybe you didn't believe that conclusion before you heard the argument. But if somebody gives an argument to explain the conclusion, then they're taking it for granted that the thing they're explaining is true, and they're trying to understand why it's true. And the argument is supposed to help us understand why it's true. Now, the weird thing about an inference to the best explanation is it really combines these two. It uses the argument to justify belief in the conclusion, that is, to give you a reason to believe that it's true, and yet a premise of the argument is that that conclusion explains a phenomenon that you took for granted. Inferences to the best explanation are extremely common. For example, almost every detective story uses an inference to the best explanation. Just imagine that there are three suspects, and you know that one of those three suspects must have done it because the door wasn't jimmied open, so whoever got into the room must have had a key, and there were only three people who had keys. But one of them couldn't have been the one who did it because she has really small feet, and the footprints outside the door were really large, and so it couldn't have been her. And the second person couldn't have done it because they have an alibi on the other side of town, so it must have been the third person who did it. And notice what you did is you can't explain why the door wasn't jimmied by the person who got in because there were no marks, and that means that the best explanation of that must be that the person who did it had a key. And the best explanation why the footprints were so large was that it was a large person who wore large shoes, and the best explanation of why the alibi would place the person on the other side of town was that they were being honest, assuming it's not their brother, or they're not the kind of person who would lie, or so on. So the best explanation of why the jewels are missing from the room or why there's a dead body in the room is that this third suspect is the one who did it. So all the detective stories work like that. It's almost always an inference to the best explanation. The best explanation is he's the one who did it. And one implication of this is that no matter what Sherlock Holmes says, the form of reasoning that he was using was inductive reasoning, not deduction, as he claimed. But it's not only detective novels, it's also science that uses inference to the best explanation. Take, for example, the greatest murder mystery in history. What killed the dinosaurs? Well, some people think that it was mammals eating their eggs. Not a chance. That doesn't explain why there were also mass extinctions in the oceans where the mammals weren't eating their eggs. Well, some people think that the best explanation is that there were big volcanic eruptions in southern India. That seems pretty unlikely too, because the volcanoes that we know didn't put out enough material to kill things all the way around the world. So they think that the best explanation of what killed the dinosaurs is that a giant meteor hit in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and that produced lots of soot in the atmosphere that killed the dinosaurs, as well as many other species at the time, but luckily not mammals. And so we now have a best explanation in science, and a lot of scientific theories work that way. As a matter of fact, the point of most scientific theories is to provide the best explanation of all the experimental data that has been observed by scientists throughout the world. And of course, we also use inference to the best explanation in our everyday lives to try to figure out what's going on around us. Here's an example.
Whoa! What was that? A drop of water just hit my head. There must be a leak in the roof. Now that is an inference to the best explanation. It starts with an observation of the water hitting my head. Then I think about why the water would be coming down. And the best explanation I can come up with is that there's a leak in the roof. So I conclude that there is a leak in the roof. Notice that this argument uses an explanation, but it runs in the opposite direction from an ordinary explanation. In an explanation, the premises explain the conclusion, and the conclusion describes the phenomenon that was observed. When there is a leak in the roof, water drops through the roof. When water comes through the roof, it drops onto whatever is in its way. I am in its way. Therefore, water drops onto me. This explains that. In contrast, an inference to the best explanation works in the opposite direction. The conclusion is what does the explaining. The premises are what get explained. And the point is to justify belief in the conclusion, not to explain it. Water drops onto me. A leak in the roof would explain why water drops onto me. No better explanation is available. Therefore, there must be a leak in the roof. Notice that the conclusion of the left argument is a premise of the right argument. And the conclusion of the right argument is part of a premise of the left argument. So, the form is different. The function is different as well. In the explanation on the left, we start out already knowing that the conclusion is true. In the inference to the best explanation on the right, we argue that the conclusion is probably true because it is the best explanation of the observation in the first premise. That's why we call it an inference to the best explanation. Is this argument valid? Yes or no? Right, it's not valid because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Now, does its invalidity make the argument bad? Yes or no? Right, it does not make it bad because an inductive argument can be good even if it's invalid. The next question's a bit trickier. Remember that an argument is defeasible if further information can make the argument weak. So, is this argument defeasible? Yes or no? Right, it is defeasible because further information could make this argument weak. So what? Does its defeasibility mean that this argument was weak even before we got that additional information? Yes or no? No, because inductive arguments can be strong even though they are defeasible. So now we know that this argument is invalid and it's defeasible, but it still might be strong and good.